In the mists of ancient Greece, before kings ruled from marble palaces and philosophers debated in stone courtyards, there existed beings who walked between the mortal and divine worlds. These were the heroes, men and women blessed with strength that could move mountains, wisdom that could outwit gods, and beauty that could start wars. Yet every single one of them fell. Tonight, as you settle into comfortable darkness, we'll explore why the greatest champions of the ancient world were destined for tragedy from the moment they drew their first breath. Their stories aren't just tales of glory, but cautionary whispers about the price of being more than human. There was a time when the boundary between heaven and earth was thin as morning mist. The gods descended from Mount Olympus, not as distant deities demanding worship, but as lovers, rivals, and parents. They walked through olive groves and danced in moonlit clearings, their immortal blood mixing with mortal veins to create something new and terrible. These unions produced children who inherited divine gifts wrapped in human flesh, blessed and cursed from their very conception. The heroes of this golden age possessed strength that could redirect rivers, speed that outran the wind itself, and voices that could charm stones to weep. They could see through illusions that fooled ordinary mortals and speak languages that animals understood. Some could heal wounds with a touch, while others could kill with a glance. Their very presence changed the air around them, making flowers bloom brighter and wine taste sweeter. Yet mortality clung to them like shadows at noon. No matter how godlike their abilities, they remained trapped within human hearts that knew jealousy, rage, and desperate longing. Their divine blood gave them the power to reshape the world, but their mortal souls ensured they would use that power unwisely. They loved too fiercely, fought too boldly, and reached too high, never understanding that their greatest strength would become their undoing. The gods who sired them watched from their clouded peaks with a mixture of pride and sorrow. They had created beings more magnificent than ordinary humans, yet more fragile than themselves. These heroes could accomplish impossible tasks, slay monsters that had terrorized kingdoms for generations, and win glory that would echo through centuries. But they could not escape the fundamental tragedy written into their divine mortal nature. As generations passed, and the heroes' deeds grew ever more legendary, the gods began to withdraw. Perhaps they recognized the cruelty of what they had done, creating beings destined for greatness and inevitable doom. The age of heroes was drawing to its close, and with it, the time when immortals and mortals could touch without destroying each other. The stories that survived would serve as both inspiration and warning, reminding future generations that some gifts come with prices too terrible to pay. Among all the children born of divine unions, none carried a heavier burden than Heracles. His father Zeus had promised his mother Alcmene that her son would rule over all his descendants, a prophecy that should have secured a throne, but instead guaranteed a lifetime of servitude. From the moment of his birth, Hera's jealous rage pursued him like a hunting hound that never tires. The goddess sent serpents to strangle him in his cradle, but the infant Heracles crushed them with his bare hands, their golden scales scattered across his nursery floor like fallen coins. This early victory revealed both his incredible gift and the terrible pattern that would define his existence. Every triumph would be born from violence. Every solution would require destruction. His strength grew beyond mortal comprehension. He could lift boulders that 20 men could not budge, and bend iron bars like soft clay. Wild animals fled his approach, sensing something in him that transcended natural law. Yet this power isolated him from ordinary human connection. When he embraced friends, he had to hold back lest he crush their ribs. When he played games, he had to lose deliberately to avoid revealing his true nature. The twist in Heracles' story wasn't his famous madness, when Hera's curse made him kill his wife and children. That tragedy, devastating as it was, followed the expected pattern of divine punishment. The real cruelty lay in what came after. The oracle at Delphi decreed that to purge his guilt, he must serve his cowardly cousin Eurystheus for 12 years, performing whatever tasks the king demanded. This servitude transformed the strongest man who ever lived into a slave. Eurystheus, who cowered in a bronze jar whenever Heracles appeared, could command the son of Zeus to clean stables, capture wild beasts, and descend into the underworld itself. The hero who could have conquered nations was reduced to performing elaborate chores. His divine strength wasted on tasks designed to humiliate rather than honor. Each labor stripped away another piece of his humanity. He learned to kill without hesitation, to destroy without remorse, to see every challenge as something to be overcome through brute force. The man who might have been a wise king became a walking weapon, knowing only how to break things that stood in his way. His strength, which should have been his blessing, became the prison that contained his diminishing soul. The gods had given him the power to change the world, but the world had changed him into something barely recognizable as the laughing infant who once strangled serpents in his sleep. The tasks that Eurystheus set before Heracles were never meant to be survived. Each labor was carefully crafted to exploit the hero's one weakness, the very humanity that his divine strength could not protect. The king consulted with oracles and monsters, weaving a web of challenges designed to strip away everything that made Heracles more than a simple killer. The Nemean lion possessed hide that no weapon could pierce, forcing Heracles to strangle it with his bare hands in the darkness of its cave. As the beast's life ebbed away beneath his grip, something fundamental changed within the hero. He had always killed in battle or rage, but this was different. This was cold, methodical execution, the systematic ending of a life that had done him no personal harm. The Hydra of Lerna grew 2 heads for everyone he severed, teaching him that some problems only worsen when attacked directly. Here he learned the value of fire, of burning away the roots of evil before new growth could emerge. The lessons scarred him deeper than the monster's poisonous breath. He began to see cleansing flame as the solution to every challenge, a purifying force that could erase complications through total destruction. Each subsequent labor demanded new forms of violence and cunning. He diverted rivers to wash away filth, captured sacred animals to drag them from their homes, stole treasures from sleeping guardians. The tasks were framed as heroic achievements, but they were systematic lessons in how to become a monster while maintaining the appearance of righteousness. The twist that defined these labors wasn't their supernatural difficulty, but their psychological architecture. Eurystheus hadn't simply chosen random, impossible tasks. He had designed a curriculum in cruelty, each challenge building upon the last to transform his cousin from a man into a living weapon. The king understood that Heracles' greatest strength could be turned against his own humanity. By the time the hero captured Cerberus from the underworld, dragging the 3-headed hound into sunlight, where it had never been meant to walk, he had forgotten what it felt like to solve problems without violence. Every challenge became a nail requiring the hammer of his strength. Every person who opposed him became an obstacle to be removed, rather than a fellow human to be reasoned with. The completion of his labors was celebrated throughout Greece as the triumph of heroism over impossible odds. Poets sang of his victories and artists carved his exploits into marble that would endure for millennia. But those who looked closely into his eyes saw the truth. The strongest man alive had been systematically emptied of everything except his strength. He had become exactly what Eurystheus intended, a perfect hero who was no longer entirely human. Freedom from his 12 labors should have restored Heracles to his rightful place among the great kings of Greece. Instead, it revealed how thoroughly his servitude had transformed him. The man who returned from his final task was no longer capable of the simple pleasures that make mortal life worth living. He had forgotten how to exist without a monster to slay or a challenge to overcome. He married Deianira, daughter of King Oeneus, winning her hand by defeating the river god Achilles in single combat. Their wedding should have marked a new beginning, but Heracles had lost the ability to be gentle. He crushed wine cups in his hands during toasts and broke furniture simply by sitting on it. His new wife learned to flinch when he approached, not from fear of his temper, but from the destructive power that radiated from him even in moments of tenderness. The centaur Nessus attempted to assault Deianira during their journey home, and Heracles killed him with an arrow dipped in the Hydra's poison. As the centaur lay dying, he whispered to Deianira that his blood would ensure her husband's eternal faithfulness, if she ever feared losing his love. This lie, delivered with a dying breath, was the most insidious trap Heracles had ever faced. Years later, when Heracles fell in love with the captive Princess Iole, Deianira remembered the centaur's words. She sent her husband a magnificent robe soaked in Nessus's blood, believing she was casting a love spell that would restore his affection. Instead, she was delivering the instrument of his destruction. The moment Heracles donned the robe, the Hydra's poison began its work. The fabric fused with his flesh, burning him with agony that even his divine constitution could not endure. He tried to tear the garment away, but it had become part of him, a second skin that would torture him until death released him from its embrace. The twist in his final chapter was not the poisoned robe itself, but his reaction to it. Any other hero would have sought help, called upon healers or gods to find a cure. Heracles instead chose to embrace his fate with the same brutal directness he had applied to every other challenge in his life. He built his own funeral pyre atop Mount Oeta and commanded his son to light it while he still lived. As the flames consumed him, Zeus finally claimed his son, lifting his spirit to Olympus to join the immortals. But even this apotheosis carried bitter irony. Heracles achieved godhood only by destroying the last remnants of his humanity. The strongest man who ever lived had spent his entire existence learning that some problems cannot be solved through force, only to apply that same force to the problem of his own mortality. While Heracles destroyed himself through overwhelming strength, Perseus carved a different path to doom through the very act that made him legendary. He was the first of the great monster slayers, the man who established the template that all future heroes would follow. Yet in killing the Gorgon Medusa, he unleashed something far worse than the creature he destroyed. Perseus had been raised believing his destiny was simple. King Polydectes desired his mother Danae and saw the young hero as an obstacle to be removed. The king's challenge seemed impossible. Bring back the head of Medusa, the only mortal among the 3 Gorgon sisters, whose gaze could turn living flesh to stone. Perseus accepted the task with the confidence of youth, believing that good intentions and divine parentage would see him through. The gods provided him with tools that made his success possible. Athena's mirrored shield allowed him to approach Medusa without meeting her deadly gaze. Hermes' winged sandals carried him across impossible distances. Hades' cap of invisibility let him strike without being seen. Armed with these gifts, Perseus found the sleeping Gorgon in her cave and severed her head with a single clean stroke. The moment her blood touched the earth, 2 beings sprang forth, Pegasus the winged horse, and Chrysa the golden warrior. These were Medusa's children by Poseidon, born from her death rather than her life. Perseus had expected to end a monster's reign of terror, but instead he had delivered new mythical beings into a world already crowded with wonders and dangers. The twist that defined Perseus' story wasn't the obvious irony of creating life through death. It was the discovery that Medusa had once been beautiful. She had been a priestess in Athena's temple, transformed into a monster as punishment for being violated within the sacred space. Perseus learned this truth only after her death, when Athena herself revealed that the Gorgon had been another victim rather than a natural evil. This knowledge poisoned every celebration of his victory. The crowds that cheered his return saw only the hero who had slain a monster and saved countless lives. Perseus alone knew that he had executed a woman whose only crime had been suffering trauma in the wrong place. The head that had turned men to stone continued to function even in death, and he found himself carrying the preserved evidence of his mistake. He used Medusa's head to rescue Andromeda from a sea monster, to defeat enemies who threatened his family, and to establish his reputation as a great hero. Each time he unveiled the severed head to turn opponents to stone, he was reminded that his greatest triumph had been built upon a fundamental misunderstanding of justice. The first monster slayer had learned too late that monsters are not born but made, and that heroes who fail to ask questions become monsters themselves. The preserved head of Medusa became Perseus' most treasured possession, and his greatest burden. Unlike other heroes whose weapons were forged in divine fire or blessed by gods, his ultimate tool was the severed remains of a victim. He carried it in a special pouch that shielded the world from its deadly gaze, but no covering could protect him from the knowledge of what he bore. Word of the Gorgon's death spread across the Mediterranean like ripples from a dropped stone. Every tyrant and monster hunter heard the tale and drew their own conclusions. If Perseus could slay Medusa, then no creature was truly unkillable. If he could turn her power against her enemies, then victory belonged to those clever enough to weaponize their defeated foes. A new kind of warfare was born, one that treated fallen enemies as resources rather than tragedies. The head's power remained undiminished by death, perhaps even enhanced by the trauma of its separation from its body. Perseus discovered that he could control its effects with practice, choosing whom to petrify and whom to spare. This selective divine judgment corrupted him in ways that straightforward combat never could have. He became accustomed to resolving disputes by threatening to unveil Medusa's face, watching as enemies and allies alike cowered before the ultimate authority. King Atlas refused Perseus hospitality during his wanderings, and the hero responded by showing him the Gorgon's head. The Titan was transformed into the mountain range that still bears his name, his body becoming stone peaks that stretch toward the sky he once held aloft. This act of petulance, disguised as justice, revealed how thoroughly Perseus had absorbed the casual cruelty that divine power enables. The twist that destroyed Perseus wasn't external opposition, but the gradual realization that he had become indistinguishable from the tyrants he opposed. Every time he used Medusa's head to solve a problem, he was choosing the path of immediate dominance over patient negotiation. He was teaching the world that might makes right, and that the strong need not justify their actions to the weak. When he finally returned to Seriphos to confront King Polydectes, Perseus found his mother enslaved and tortured in his absence. His rage was absolute and righteous, but his method of vengeance revealed how far he had fallen. He burst into the king's throne room and unveiled Medusa's head before the entire court, turning every person present to stone without distinguishing between the guilty and the innocent. The hall filled with statues captured in their final moments of terror, servants and courtiers frozen alongside their cruel king. Perseus had achieved perfect justice, according to his own definition. But he had also demonstrated that he no longer saw other people as individuals worthy of consideration. They had all become potential threats to be neutralized or obstacles to be removed. The hero who started the age of monster slayers had completed his transformation into the very thing he once hunted. Medusa's final victim was the man who killed her, though he would spend the rest of his life pretending otherwise. Perseus had shown that heroes could become monsters through their victories, but Theseus proved that they could lose themselves in the very qualities that made them heroic. The Prince of Athens possessed everything a perfect leader needed: courage that never wavered, intelligence that could solve any puzzle, and a sense of justice that burned like sacred flame. These virtues, pursued without wisdom, became the instruments of his downfall. Young Theseus traveled to Athens by the dangerous overland route, deliberately choosing hardship over the safe sea passage his grandfather recommended. Along the way he encountered bandits and monsters who preyed on travelers, and he defeated each one using their own methods against them. Procrustes, who stretched or shortened victims to fit his iron bed, was subjected to his own torture. Sciron, who kicked travelers off cliffs, was hurled from the same precipice. This poetic justice satisfied Theseus' sense of rightness, but it also taught him that virtue could be expressed through violence. In Athens, he volunteered to join the tribute of young men and women sent to feed the Minotaur in Crete's labyrinth. King Minos had demanded this price after his son's death during the Panathenaic Games, and no Athenian had ever returned alive from the maze beneath the palace. Theseus promised his father Achilles that he would slay the monster and return under white sails, rather than the black ones that marked the ship of the doomed. Ariadne, daughter of King Minos, fell in love with the handsome prince and provided him with the thread that would guide him back from the labyrinth's heart. Theseus followed the maze's twisting passages to find the Minotaur, a creature born from his mother's unnatural union with a sacred bull. The monster was as much victim as threat, trapped in the darkness and fed on human flesh, not by choice, but by the cruel design of its birth. The battle was brief and brutal. Theseus strangled the Minotaur with his bare hands, feeling its hybrid body go limp beneath his grip. But the victory felt hollow in the maze's suffocating darkness. He had killed a creature that had never chosen its nature or its prison, ending a life that had known nothing but hunger and loneliness. The hero who prided himself on justice had executed a being whose only crime was existing in a form that others found monstrous. The twist that defined Theseus wasn't his abandonment of Ariadne on the island of Naxos, though that betrayal revealed his capacity for casual cruelty. The real tragedy lay in his return to Athens. So intoxicated was he with his own triumph that he forgot to change his sails from black to white. His father, Achilles, watching from the cliff, saw the black sails approaching and threw himself into the sea in grief, believing his son was dead. Theseus had achieved everything he set out to accomplish. He had slain the monster, freed Athens from its terrible tribute, and returned as a conquering hero. But his moment of thoughtlessness had cost him the one person whose approval mattered most. The king, who had spent his life making careful moral calculations, had failed to perform the simplest act of consideration. He would rule Athens for many years, but he would never again trust his own judgment completely. The death of the Minotaur should have ended the cycle of violence that began with King Minos' hubris, but instead it planted seeds of a different kind of destruction. Theseus returned to Athens as a celebrated monster slayer, yet he carried within him something far more dangerous than the creature he had destroyed. He had learned that problems could be solved by finding their heart and crushing it, a lesson that would reshape not just his reign, but his very soul. The Minotaur had been born from Queen Pasiphae's unnatural desire for a sacred bull, a punishment inflicted by Poseidon when Minos refused to sacrifice the creature as promised. The monster that resulted was neither fully human nor fully beast, trapped in a form that satisfied no natural need or instinct. Its existence had been a constant reminder of divine displeasure and mortal foolishness, a living symbol of consequences that could not be undone. In killing the Minotaur, Theseus believed he was ending an abomination, but he was actually perpetuating the very mindset that had created it. Minos had built the labyrinth because he could not bear to look upon the evidence of his family's shame. Theseus had entered the maze because he could not tolerate the existence of something that threatened his people. Both men had chosen to hide away or destroy what made them uncomfortable, rather than seeking understanding. The hero's return to Athens marked the beginning of his transformation into the kind of king he had once opposed. He ruled with the same absolute certainty that had guided him through the labyrinth, making swift decisions based on limited information. When problems arose, he sought their source and eliminated it with the directness he had used on the Minotaur. Dissent was crushed, opposition was exiled, and complexity was reduced to simple questions of loyalty. The twist that defined this phase of Theseus' story wasn't his growing tyranny, which many could see developing, but the way he began to view other people. The labyrinth had taught him that every problem had a center, a single point of corruption that could be identified and removed. He started seeing his subjects not as individuals with complex motivations, but as potential sources of chaos that might require elimination. When the Amazon queen Antiope bore him a son, Theseus found himself genuinely happy for the first time since his father's death. But even this joy was poisoned by his need to control and categorize. He began to see his family as another territory to be governed, another maze to be mapped and mastered. His love became indistinguishable from his need to possess and direct. The Minotaur's true revenge was not some supernatural curse, but the way its death had confirmed Theseus' belief that violence was the ultimate solution to complicated problems. The monster had been the first knot he cut rather than untied, the first question he answered with force rather than thought. Every subsequent challenge would be approached the same way, with the confident stride of a hero walking toward the center of a maze, knowing that something waited there to be killed. While Theseus lost himself in the machinery of kingship, Achilles was born into a prophecy that made loss inevitable from his first breath. His mother Thetis had been given a choice by the fates themselves. Her son could live a long, peaceful life in obscurity, or he could achieve immortal glory through an early death. The decision seemed obvious to the sea nymph, who had been forced to marry a mortal, but the choice was crueler than she understood. Thetis tried to cheat destiny by dipping her infant son in the waters of the river Styx, holding him by his heel as the divine current washed over his body. The river's power made his flesh invulnerable to any weapon, but the spot where her fingers gripped remained mortal and fragile. She had succeeded only in ensuring that when death finally claimed her son, it would come through the one part of him she had touched. The young Achilles grew up, knowing he was different from other children. Swords bent against his skin, arrows bounced harmlessly from his chest, and fire could not burn him. This invulnerability should have been a blessing, but it isolated him from human experience in ways that divine blood alone could not. He could not understand fear as other warriors knew it, could not comprehend the courage required to face death when death was genuinely possible. His tutor Chiron, wisest of the centaurs, tried to teach him empathy by showing him the fragility of mortal life. They would walk through battlefields after skirmishes, and Chiron would point out how quickly human bodies failed, how easily the spark of consciousness could be extinguished. But to Achilles, these lessons only reinforced his separation from ordinary humanity. He saw himself as fundamentally different, a being who transcended the limitations that defined everyone else. When Paris stole Helen from Menelaus, and the Greek armies assembled for war against Troy, Achilles faced the fulfillment of his mother's prophecy. He could stay home and live peacefully, watching other men win glory while he tended sheep, and grew old in anonymity. Or he could join the expedition and achieve the kind of fame that would echo through eternity, knowing that glory would cost him everything. The twist that sealed Achilles' fate wasn't his decision to choose glory over long life, though that choice seemed to determine everything that followed. The real trap lay in his understanding of what glory meant. He believed that immortal fame would justify any sacrifice, that being remembered forever was worth any price in present happiness. But he had never considered that the price might not be paid only by himself. The moment he set foot on Trojan soil, Achilles began the process of becoming the very thing his enemies claimed he was, a monster in human form, a killing machine that felt no pity and showed no mercy. His invulnerability made him reckless with other lives because he could not truly comprehend what it meant to lose one. The boy who had been born for death was about to learn that dying was the easy part of his destiny. The war at Troy had already dragged on for 9 years when Achilles discovered that invulnerability could be its own kind of prison. He had won every single combat, killed every champion the Trojans sent against him, and earned the kind of reputation that made enemies flee at the sight of his bronze armor. Yet each victory felt hollow, because no one could truly challenge him. He was a wolf hunting sheep, a storm devastating flowers. The plague that Apollo sent against the Greek camp gave Achilles his first taste of a problem that could not be solved with sword and spear. When the seer Calchas revealed that Agamemnon must return his prize, the priest's daughter Chryseis to end the divine punishment, the king agreed but demanded Achilles' own captive Briseis as compensation. This was not about the woman herself, but about the respect due to the greatest warrior in the army. Agamemnon's seizure of Briseis was the first real wound Achilles had ever received, and it cut deeper than any blade could have. His physical invulnerability had left him emotionally defenseless, unable to process humiliation or injustice in the way that ordinary men learned through smaller hurts accumulated over time. The rage that filled him was pure and terrible, uncomplicated by fear or doubt. He withdrew from the fighting entirely, taking his myrmidons with him, and leaving the other Greeks to face Hector and the Trojan champions alone. This was meant to be a demonstration of his value, proof that the army could not function without him. Instead, it became something darker, a petulant god's tantrum that cost thousands of lives. His anger was so vast that it seemed to alter the weather itself, bringing storms that battered both camps. The twist that transformed Achilles' rage from understandable fury into something monstrous was the way it expanded beyond its original cause. When Patroclus donned his armor and died fighting Hector, Achilles' grief and guilt fused with his existing anger to create something unprecedented. This was no longer about honor or recognition, but about the fundamental unfairness of a world that could take away the one person who truly understood him. His return to battle was not the triumphant comeback of a hero, but the unleashing of a force of nature that had been given human form. He did not simply kill Hector. He mutilated the Trojan prince's corpse and dragged it behind his chariot for 12 days, denying the dead man the funeral rites that even enemies deserved. The other Greek warriors watched in horror as their greatest champion revealed himself to be something that transcended normal concepts of justice or mercy. When King Priam came to beg for his son's body, Achilles finally saw himself through another's eyes. The old king's grief was so pure and overwhelming that it cut through the hero's rage like sunlight through storm clouds. For the first time since Patroclus' death, Achilles remembered what it meant to feel sympathy for another human being. But the recognition came too late. He had already become the monster that his enemies claimed he was, and no amount of late arriving wisdom could undo what his rage had created. While Achilles wrestled with the terrible freedom that invulnerability granted, his greatest enemy faced the opposite curse. Hector of Troy carried the weight of being genuinely good in a world that punished virtue more severely than vice. He was the eldest son of King Priam, the defender of his city's walls, and the one man in the entire war who fought for something larger than personal glory or wounded pride. Every morning, Hector rose before dawn to walk the battlements and check on his soldiers. He knew their names, their families, their fears. When young warriors trembled before their first battle, he would speak quietly with them about courage, explaining that bravery was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act rightly despite it. His men would have followed him into the underworld itself, not because he commanded them, but because he made them believe they were part of something noble. The tragedy of Hector's position was that he served a cause that could not be morally defended. Paris had stolen Helen from her husband, violating the sacred bond of hospitality and bringing war to Troy's gates. Every rational voice in the city counseled returning the woman and seeking peace. But pride and politics made compromise impossible. Hector found himself in the impossible position of fighting honorably for a fundamentally dishonorable cause. He faced this contradiction by choosing to protect rather than attack. While other heroes sought glory through conquest, Hector made his reputation by standing firm when others would have fled. He became a master of defensive warfare, turning every retreat into a strategic withdrawal and every defeat into a lesson that would serve Troy better in the next engagement. His victories were measured not in enemies killed, but in citizens saved. The twist that defined Hector's story was not his death at Achilles' hands, though that moment concentrated all the war's brutality into a single combat. The real tragedy lay in the gradual realization that his goodness was accelerating Troy's destruction. Every time he rallied the defenders, every moment he prolonged the siege, he was ensuring that more of his people would die when the city finally fell. Had Hector been a lesser man, a coward, or a fool, Troy would have surrendered years earlier. The Greeks would have taken Helen, imposed tribute, and sailed home. Thousands of lives would have been spared, and the great city would have survived diminished but intact. Instead, his heroic defense gave the Trojans hope that they could actually win, encouraging them to fight on toward their inevitable doom. When he killed Patroclus in battle, striking down the young warrior who wore Achilles' armor, Hector sealed not only his own fate, but that of everyone he had spent his life protecting. He had given Achilles the personal motive needed to end the war through overwhelming violence. The last good man in Troy had become the instrument of its final destruction. His very virtue transformed into the weapon that would demolish everything he held dear. The death of Hector should have marked the end of meaningful resistance at Troy, but it instead revealed how the war had corrupted even the most steadfast Greek heroes. Ajax the Great had stood as a pillar of strength throughout the siege, second only to Achilles in combat prowess, but far superior in stability and judgment. He was the kind of warrior that poets celebrated, brave without being reckless, strong without being cruel, loyal without being blind. When Achilles fell to Paris' arrow, guided by Apollo to the one vulnerable spot on the hero's body, the greatest prize of the war became available. Achilles' armor, forged by Hephaestus himself, and decorated with scenes that moved like living art, was claimed by Theseus to be awarded to whoever had contributed most to the Greek victory. The choice came down to Ajax and Odysseus, strength against cunning, honest valor against clever strategy. The Greek chieftains were asked to judge between the two claimants, and their decision revealed how thoroughly the long war had changed their values. They chose Odysseus, recognizing that his infiltrations and stratagems had done more to weaken Troy than Ajax's countless acts of simple heroism. The vote was not even close. The assembly preferred the man who won through deception to the one who prevailed through courage. Ajax received this judgment in perfect silence. He had never been a man of many words, preferring to let his actions speak for his character. But the other Greeks began to notice troubling signs in the days that followed. He stopped joining the evening councils, refused invitations to share meals, and spent long hours staring across the water toward the distant shores of home. His friends assumed he was simply disappointed, but something far more dangerous was growing in his mind. The twist that destroyed Ajax was not the familiar corruption of power, or the intoxication of violence that had claimed other heroes. Instead, it was the discovery that honor had become meaningless, that the very virtues he had spent his life cultivating were no longer valued by the society he served. He had believed that doing the right thing consistently would eventually be recognized and rewarded. But the war had taught everyone to prefer results over methods. That night, Ajax took his sword and walked among the sleeping herds of cattle and sheep that fed the Greek army. In his madness, he saw the animals as his enemies, Agamemnon and Menelaus, Odysseus and the other chieftains who had denied him recognition. He slaughtered dozens of beasts, covering himself in blood while believing he was finally receiving the justice he deserved. When dawn broke and revealed what he had actually done, the humiliation was more than his rigid honor could bear. Ajax fell upon his own sword rather than live with the knowledge that he had become a figure of ridicule. The man who had never retreated from any enemy, who had held the Greek ships against Hector's assault when all seemed lost, could not survive the revelation that his entire moral framework had become obsolete. He died believing that honor was worth more than life, never understanding that the war had already killed honor years before it claimed him. Where Ajax had died because the world no longer valued simple virtue, Odysseus thrived by abandoning virtue entirely. The king of Ithaca had begun the war as a reluctant participant, feigning madness to avoid honoring his oath to defend Helen's chosen husband. When that deception failed, he had thrown himself into the conflict with an intelligence that slowly transformed from blessing into curse. His mind was the sharpest weapon in the Greek arsenal, capable of seeing patterns and possibilities that escaped other men entirely. He had devised the strategy that brought Achilles to Troy, orchestrated the recruitment of other heroes, and planned the complex logistics that kept the army supplied. Across a decade of siege warfare, where other leaders relied on strength or courage, Odysseus wielded cunning like a master craftsman shaping bronze. The Trojan horse was his masterpiece, a deception so perfect that it convinced the defenders to bring their own destruction inside their walls. The Greeks who hid in the wooden belly understood that they were participating in something unprecedented, a victory won through pure intellect rather than martial prowess. When they emerged in Troy's darkness to open the gates for their army, they were fulfilling Odysseus's vision of how wars should truly be fought. The sack of Troy revealed the cost of his methods. The city burned with uncontrolled fury as Greek soldiers, frustrated by 10 years of siege, took their revenge on everyone they could find. Odysseus watched the destruction with growing unease, recognizing that his clever strategy had unleashed something far beyond what he had intended. His surgical strike had become indiscriminate slaughter, his precise plan degraded into chaos. The twist that defined Odysseus' downfall was not external punishment, but the way his own intelligence turned against him. Having solved the problem of Troy through deception, he began to see every subsequent challenge as another puzzle requiring clever manipulation. When Poseidon cursed his journey home, Odysseus responded with increasingly elaborate schemes that only deepened the god's anger and prolonged his exile. Each island he visited became a laboratory for testing new forms of cunning. He tricked the Cyclops Polyphemus, but could not resist revealing his true name, turning escape into ongoing vendetta. He outwitted the sirens by stopping his ears with wax, but left his men bound and helpless during the encounter. He navigated between Scylla and Charybdis by sacrificing 6 crew members to save the ship, calculating lives like a merchant counting coins. By the time he reached Ithaca after 20 years of war and wandering, Odysseus had become incapable of straightforward action. He disguised himself as a beggar to infiltrate his own palace, testing the loyalty of servants and family members who had waited decades for his return. Even his reunion with Penelope required elaborate proofs and clever stratagems. The man who had once used his intelligence to serve others had become enslaved to it, unable to trust in simple human connection or direct communication. His mind, the weapon that had won the war, had made him a stranger in his own life. While Odysseus learned that cleverness could become its own trap, Bellerophon discovered that divine favor was the most dangerous gift of all. The young prince of Corinth possessed everything that marked a perfect hero: noble birth, physical beauty, and a courage that bordered on recklessness. Yet these qualities meant nothing compared to the moment when he first laid eyes on Pegasus, the winged horse born from Medusa's blood. The beast had terrorized the countryside around Corinth, appearing like a white flame against the sky before vanishing into the clouds. No earthly horse could match its speed, and no hunter could predict where it would appear next. Bellerophon became obsessed with capturing the creature, not for any practical purpose, but because the challenge seemed impossible enough to be worthy of a true hero's attention. Athena appeared to him in a dream, offering a golden bridle that would tame the winged horse. When he woke, the bridle lay beside his bed, its metal warm to the touch, and inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift when viewed directly. The goddess had not explained why she was helping him, or what price her assistance might carry, but Bellerophon was too intoxicated by the possibility of flight to question her motives. Pegasus accepted the bridle without resistance, as if it had been waiting for this moment since its birth. The first time Bellerophon mounted the winged horse and felt himself lifted above the earth, he understood that he had transcended the limitations that defined mortal existence. He could travel faster than any messenger, see farther than any scout, and strike from angles that no enemy could anticipate or defend against. King Iobates of Lycia sent him against the Chimera, a monster that breathed fire and possessed the head of a lion, the body of a goat, and the tail of a serpent. From Pegasus' back, Bellerophon could attack the beast without risking its flames, driving his spear down through its skull with the full force of a diving strike. The victory was so complete and so visually spectacular that it established his reputation as the greatest monster slayer since Perseus. The twist that destroyed Bellerophon was not hubris in the conventional sense, though pride certainly played its part. The real trap lay in the way flight separated him from every meaningful human relationship. He could no longer walk among ordinary people without being reminded of how limited their perspective was, how small their concerns seemed from the heights he had mastered. Even his closest friends appeared to be crawling across the earth like insects, their problems trivial and their ambitions laughably modest. When he finally attempted to fly to Olympus itself, seeking to join the gods as an equal, Zeus sent a gadfly to sting Pegasus. The horse bucked violently, throwing its rider back to earth where he landed broken and half-mad. Bellerophon survived the fall, but spent the rest of his life wandering alone, unable to forget what it felt like to soar above the world and unwilling to accept that such heights were not meant for mortal men. The broken man who had once ridden Pegasus across the heavens became a living reminder of what happened when mortals forgot their place in the cosmic order. Bellerophon's fall had not simply injured his body. It had shattered something essential in his understanding of reality. He had touched the realm of the gods and been cast out, leaving him suspended between human and divine existence, with no clear path back to either. He wandered the wilderness of Lycia like a ghost, avoiding cities and settlements where people might recognize the hero he had once been. His victories over the Chimera and the Amazons seemed like stories from another man's life, achievements that belonged to someone who had died in the fall from Pegasus' back. The few travelers who encountered him reported a figure more beast than man, living on wild fruit and speaking to invisible companions. The cruel irony of his condition was that he retained perfect memory of what flight had felt like. He could recall every detail of soaring above cloud-covered mountains, of seeing the earth spread out below him like a map drawn by the gods themselves. These memories were not comfort but torture, constant reminders of a perspective he could never reclaim. He had learned to see the world as the gods saw it, but he remained trapped in a mortal body bound to walk upon the ground. King Iobates, who had once celebrated Bellerophon as his greatest champion, sent search parties to find the hero and bring him back to court. The king genuinely wanted to help, offering healers and wise women who might restore his former friend's shattered mind. But Bellerophon fled from these well-meaning rescuers as if they were armed enemies, understanding instinctively that their cure would require him to forget what he had experienced above the clouds. The twist that made Bellerophon's madness particularly tragic was its fundamental accuracy. His ravings about the petty concerns of earthbound mortals were not delusions, but clear-sighted observations from someone who had briefly shared the god's perspective. He saw through the pretensions and elaborate social structures that gave meaning to ordinary human life, recognizing them as arbitrary games played by creatures too limited to grasp larger truths. His former allies began to avoid him, not because his words were nonsensical, but because they made too much sense. When he pointed out the ultimate futility of their wars and political schemes, when he described their most cherished beliefs as shadows cast by ignorance, he was speaking from knowledge they could not share or refute. His madness was the sanity of a being caught between worlds, able to see clearly but powerless to act on what he saw. The gods had not punished Bellerophon for attempting to reach Olympus. They had punished him by allowing him to see just enough of their realm to understand what he was missing. His fall was not from a great height to the ground, but from perfect knowledge to imperfect existence, from divine clarity to mortal confusion. He became a living example of why some boundaries were not meant to be crossed. Not because the gods were cruel, but because mortal minds were not designed to contain infinite perspective. While Bellerophon had been destroyed by seeing too much, Orpheus possessed a different kind of divine gift that proved equally dangerous. His voice could move stones to tears and convince rivers to flow uphill. But more importantly, it could make anyone who heard it feel the full weight of beauty and loss that defined mortal existence. The son of Apollo and the muse Calliope had inherited music that transcended mere entertainment to become a force that could reshape reality itself. When Orpheus sang, wild animals forgot their hunger and gathered peacefully around him. Trees uprooted themselves to move closer to his voice, and even the wind would still itself to listen. His music did not simply please the ear. It reached directly into the soul and awakened feelings that most people spent their lives trying to avoid. He could make the happiest person weep with longing and bring hope to those who had abandoned all possibility of joy. Eurydice, the wood nymph who became his wife, was the only person who could hear his songs without being overwhelmed by their emotional intensity. She loved him for the man he was rather than the divine gift he possessed, and her presence allowed him to sing simple human songs about ordinary pleasures. For a brief time, Orpheus discovered what it meant to use his power for pure joy rather than as an overwhelming force that commanded attention and reverence. Her death from a serpent's bite during their wedding feast shattered something fundamental in Orpheus's understanding of how his gift should be used. The music that had always brought life and movement suddenly seemed hollow and meaningless. He could still make stones weep and trees dance, but these miracles felt like cruel jokes when the one person who mattered most lay cold and still beneath the earth. His decision to descend into the underworld was not motivated by hope, but by a kind of musical logic that made perfect sense to his artistic mind. If his songs could move the immovable and change the unchangeable, then surely they could convince even death itself to release what it had claimed. He walked past Cerberus and the other guardians of Hades' realm, his lyre converting their hostility into something approaching sympathy. The twist that destroyed Orpheus was not his backward glance that lost Eurydice forever, though that moment concentrated all his tragedy into a single gesture. The real catastrophe lay in what his music became after his failure. Having touched the ultimate sorrow and been denied consolation, his songs transformed from celebrations of beauty into weapons of pure emotional devastation. He could no longer control the intensity of feeling his voice produced. When he returned to the world above, Orpheus began to sing with a desperate fury that drove his listeners to madness. His music became so saturated with grief and loss that it infected everyone who heard it with his own inconsolable pain. Cities emptied as people abandoned their responsibilities to follow the sound of his voice, and families dissolved as his songs convinced them that all earthly attachments were ultimately meaningless. The gift that had once brought harmony to the world became a plague of beautiful despair that spread wherever he wandered. The moment when Orpheus turned to look at Eurydice as they climbed from the underworld has been remembered as the supreme example of human weakness overcoming divine possibility. But the truth of that backward glance was far more complex than simple impatience or doubt. In the depths of Hades' realm, Orpheus had learned something about the nature of love that no living person was meant to understand. Hades and Persephone had wept as they listened to his songs about loss and longing, and their tears had convinced them to grant what no mortal had ever received, the return of someone claimed by death. But their agreement came with a condition that seemed simple enough. Orpheus must walk ahead of Eurydice on the path to the surface, never looking back until both had emerged into sunlight. The restriction appeared to be a test of faith, but it was actually something far more cruel. As they climbed through the shadowy passages that led back to life, Orpheus began to notice that Eurydice cast no shadow and made no sound. Her footsteps fell silent on the stone path, and when he reached back without looking, his fingers found only empty air where her hand should have been. The growing suspicion that he was climbing alone, that the gods had deceived him with false hope, became harder to ignore with every step. The twist that defined this moment was not that Orpheus lacked faith in divine promise, but that he possessed too much knowledge about the nature of the underworld. His songs had given him insight into the realm of the dead, and he understood that spirits existed differently there than living souls. Eurydice was following him, but she was following as a shade, a memory given temporary form rather than a restored life. When he finally turned to look, it was not from doubt but from a terrible certainty. He had realized that the god's gift was contaminated from the beginning, that Eurydice would emerge from the underworld as something that resembled his wife, but lacked the essential spark that had made her human. His backward glance was an act of mercy rather than weakness, choosing to lose her completely rather than live with a beautiful hollow thing that wore her face. The sight of her fading form confirmed his worst fears. She was already becoming translucent as the underworld reclaimed her, and her eyes held the distant expression of the dead rather than the warm recognition of the living. His choice had been between accepting a lie that would have slowly poisoned his memory of their love and preserving the truth of what they had shared, even if it meant eternal separation. Orpheus's real tragedy was not that he failed the gods' test, but that he passed a far more difficult examination of his own making. He had chosen authentic loss over comfortable deception, genuine grief over false consolation. The backward glance that seemed to damn him was actually the last truly loving act he could perform. For the woman who had made his music meaningful, his gift had taught him to value truth over happiness, and that knowledge destroyed any possibility of peace. While Orpheus had been destroyed by knowledge of love's true nature, Atalanta discovered that running from connection could be just as fatal as pursuing it. The daughter of King Iasus had been abandoned as an infant and raised by bears in the wilderness, learning to survive through speed and cunning rather than the social bonds that defined human civilization. Her feet had never known the weight of dependence on others when she finally returned to human society. Atalanta brought with her abilities that transcended normal athletic achievement. She could outrun deer through dense forest, her feet finding purchase on loose stones that would have tripped ordinary runners. Her speed was not just physical, but seemed to extend to her thinking, allowing her to process information and make decisions faster than her opponents could react to changing circumstances. King Iasus welcomed his daughter back with the mixture of pride and calculation that defined royal fathers. He had gained not just an heir, but a living legend whose fame could enhance his kingdom's reputation. The stories of her prowess spread quickly. She had killed centaurs who tried to assault her, won wrestling matches against the strongest men in Greece, and sailed with the Argonauts as the only woman among Jason's heroes. Her participation in the Caledonian boar hunt established her as the equal of any male hero when the massive beast emerged from the thicket to charge the hunting party. Atalanta was the first to draw blood, her arrow finding its mark while seasoned warriors still struggled to position themselves for attack. The kill belonged officially to Meleager, but everyone present knew that her shot had been the decisive blow. The attention that followed her victories became a problem she had never anticipated. Suitors arrived from across the Mediterranean, princes and heroes, who saw marriage to the famous huntress as a prize worth any effort. But Atalanta had learned in the wilderness that partnerships were temporary arrangements of convenience, and she could not understand why these men wanted to bind themselves to her permanently. The twist that defined Atalanta's story was not her eventual defeat in the foot race that determined her marriage, but the reason she had agreed to the contest in the first place. Her father's pressure was relentless, and she realized that refusing all suitors would eventually lead to more direct forms of coercion. The race seemed like a clever solution, offering marriage on terms that played to her greatest strength. She had never encountered anyone who could match her speed, and she assumed that setting this challenge would rid her of unwanted attention while preserving the illusion that marriage remained possible. The condition that unsuccessful suitors would be executed was meant to discourage all but the most determined, reducing the number of races she would need to run. She had not considered that her very speed might have made her a prize worth dying for. Atalanta's confidence in her invincibility was not arrogance, but a rational assessment based on lifetime of experience. She had never been caught by anything she chose to run from, never failed to escape when discretion seemed wiser than confrontation. Speed had been her salvation, her weapon, and her freedom. The possibility that it might become her trap had simply never occurred to her. The young man who finally accepted Atalanta's challenge brought more than courage to the race that would determine both their fates. Hippomenes had spent months studying her previous contests, watching how she moved and trying to understand the source of her seemingly supernatural speed. He was intelligent enough to recognize that he could never win through superior athleticism, but wisdom enough to seek help from a more powerful source. Aphrodite had grown tired of watching mortals treat love as an obstacle to be avoided rather than a gift to be embraced. The goddess saw in Atalanta's determined independence a challenge to the natural order that governed both divine and human relationships. When Hippomenes came to her temple seeking aid, she provided him with 3 golden apples taken from the garden of the Hesperides, fruit so beautiful that they could make even the most focused mind pause in wonder. The race began like all the others, with Atalanta pulling ahead of her challenger in the first few strides. Her speed seemed effortless, as if she were floating above the ground rather than running across it. Hippomenes fell behind immediately, but his pace was steady and his breathing controlled. The spectators assumed they were watching another execution in the making, another suitor about to pay the ultimate price for his presumption. When Hippomenes threw the first golden apple to the side of the track, Atalanta's reaction was instantaneous and completely involuntary. The fruit blazed with divine light, and her eyes followed its arc without conscious decision. She found herself slowing, then stopping, then walking over to pick up the apple, despite every rational thought screaming at her to ignore the distraction and continue running. The twist that destroyed Atalanta was not that she lost the race through feminine vanity or greed, as later storytellers would claim. The golden apples were not simply beautiful objects that appealed to her aesthetic sense. They were tools of divine compulsion that bypassed her conscious will entirely. Aphrodite had not given Hippomenes a fair advantage, but had rigged the contest at a level that Atalanta could not have anticipated or defended against. Each time she picked up one of the golden fruits, Atalanta experienced a moment of genuine terror. She realized that her body was acting against her mind's clear commands, that something was overriding the discipline and focus that had kept her alive throughout her dangerous life. The speed that had always been her choice was being taken away from her by forces beyond her understanding or control. By the time Hippomenes crossed the finish line first, Atalanta understood that she had not simply lost a race, but had been systematically betrayed by powers she had never considered. The goddess who governed love had decided that her independence was unacceptable and had arranged her defeat through supernatural intervention. Her marriage would not be the result of fair competition, but of divine manipulation, and no amount of speed could outrun a fate that the gods themselves had decided to impose. Where Atalanta had been defeated by divine intervention disguised as fair competition, Penthesilea faced a different kind of trap. The seductive promise that war could provide meaning to a life that had lost all other purpose. The Amazon queen had ruled her warrior women with wisdom and strength, leading them in battles that protected their homeland from invasion while maintaining the delicate balance of power that allowed their society to flourish. The death of her sister Hippolyte at the hands of Heracles had shattered something fundamental in Penthesilea's understanding of how the world operated. The Amazons had always been able to defend themselves through superior skill and tactics, but the hero's divine strength had made their martial expertise irrelevant. For the first time, Penthesilea faced the possibility that courage and training might not be enough to protect what she loved most. Her decision to lead a contingent of Amazon warriors to Troy's aid was born not from political calculation, but from a desperate need to prove that heroism still mattered in a world increasingly dominated by divine intervention and overwhelming force. If she could help the Trojans defeat the Greeks, if she could show that mortal skill could triumph over legendary heroes, then perhaps her sister's death would not represent the end of everything the Amazons had built. King Priam welcomed the Amazon reinforcements with the gratitude of a man watching his city die by degrees. The long siege had worn down his defenders, and Hector's death had stripped away the last hope that Trojan valor alone could drive off the invaders. Penthesilea's arrival offered not just fresh troops, but the symbolic power of legendary warriors choosing to fight for Troy's survival. The Amazon Queen's first day on the battlefield seemed to justify every hope that her presence had inspired. She cut through Greek formations like a blade through silk, her warriors moving in perfect coordination behind her as they drove their enemies back toward their ships. For a few glorious hours, it appeared that skill and determination could indeed overcome the fatalistic despair that had settled over Troy's defenders. The twist that sealed Penthesilea's fate was not her death at Achilles' hands, though that moment concentrated all the war's cruelty into a single combat. The real tragedy lay in her realization, in the moments before the fatal blow fell, that she had not come to Troy to save the city, but to find an honorable way to die. The grief over her sister's death had made life unbearable, but suicide was forbidden to Amazon royalty. As Achilles' spear pierced her armor, Penthesilea finally understood that she had been seeking death from the moment she decided to join a hopeless cause. Her arrival at Troy had not been motivated by strategic wisdom or noble self-sacrifice, but by a subconscious desire to follow her sister into the darkness. The war had provided the perfect cover for what was essentially an elaborate suicide, allowing her to die with honor while abandoning the responsibilities that had become too painful to bear. The Amazon warriors who survived her death found themselves stranded in a foreign land, their queen dead and their purpose fulfilled in the worst possible way. They had followed Penthesilea to Troy believing they were supporting a great cause, only to discover that they had been unwitting participants in their leader's personal tragedy. The strongest of the Amazon queens had taught them that even legendary courage could become a mask for despair too deep to heal. While Penthesilea had sought death as an escape from unbearable loss, King Midas discovered that getting exactly what you wish for can be far more terrible than any defeat. The ruler of Phrygia had built his kingdom through careful diplomacy and shrewd trade agreements, transforming a modest realm into one of the wealthiest nations in the ancient world. Yet prosperity had only intensified his hunger for more, turning abundance into a source of constant anxiety about what might be lost. When the satyr Silenus wandered drunk and lost into Midas' gardens, the king treated the creature with unexpected kindness. He provided food, shelter, and entertainment for 10 days before personally escorting the satyr back to his divine master. Dionysus, god of wine and revelry, was so pleased by this courtesy toward his companion that he offered to grant any wish Midas might desire. The king's request seemed reasonable to a man who had spent his life calculating profit and loss. He asked that everything he touched might turn to gold, imagining the limitless wealth that such power would bring. He envisioned golden palaces that would make other rulers weep with envy, treasures that would secure his dynasty for 1,000 generations, and the absolute financial security that had eluded him, despite all his previous success. Dionysus granted the wish with the casual generosity of a god who understood consequences that mortals could not foresee. The transformation of Midas' first touch was miraculous. A simple olive branch became gleaming metal in his hands, its leaves preserving their delicate shape while gaining the weight and luster of precious gold. The king laughed with delight as he experimented with his new ability, transforming stones and flowers into treasures beyond imagination. The dinner celebration that night should have marked the beginning of a golden age for Phrygia, but it instead revealed the true nature of divine gifts. When Midas reached for bread, it became metal in his mouth. Wine turned to liquid gold that burned his throat. Even the simplest pleasure of eating had been stripped away by the very power he had requested. His touch, which should have brought wealth, had made him incapable of sustaining his own life. The twist that destroyed Midas was not the obvious irony of starving amid infinite riches, though that paradox was cruel enough. The real horror lay in the discovery that his golden touch extended to living beings as well as inanimate objects. When his beloved daughter ran to embrace him in celebration of his divine gift, she transformed instantly into a golden statue that preserved her smile and outstretched arms in perfect lifeless detail. The statue was exquisitely beautiful, more precious than any treasure in his vast collection. But it was no longer his child. He could see his daughter's face frozen in eternal joy, could trace the familiar curves of her features in precious metal, but he could never again hear her laugh or feel the warmth of her living embrace. Midas had gained the power to create infinite wealth, and lost the ability to touch anything that made wealth worthwhile. The golden touch that should have solved all his problems had transformed him into the loneliest man alive. Where Midas had learned that material desires could consume the spirit, Tantalus discovered that betraying divine trust carried consequences that transcended ordinary punishment. The king of Sepilus had been honored above all other mortals, invited to dine with the gods themselves, and share in conversations that revealed the hidden workings of the universe. His place at the divine table should have been the ultimate privilege, but proximity to infinite power had awakened appetites that no mortal was meant to possess. Tantalus had gained the gods' favor through his wisdom and apparent piety, but their trust had gradually corrupted him in ways that neither he nor they initially recognized. He began to see their omniscience as a resource to be exploited, their friendship as a path to advantages that other kings could never access. The knowledge he gained from divine conversations was used to manipulate markets, predict weather patterns, and position his kingdom for success that seemed miraculous to outside observers. The gods' casual attitude toward their own immortality fascinated and horrified Tantalus in equal measure. They spoke of eternity as if it were merely an extended afternoon, treating powers that could reshape reality as simple tools for their convenience. He became obsessed with understanding what made them fundamentally different from mortals, what essential quality separated temporary existence from eternal life. His decision to test their divine nature took the form of an invitation that seemed like generous hospitality. Tantalus prepared a feast for his immortal guests, but the main course was his own son Pelops, butchered and cooked with the same care he would have lavished on any sacred offering. He wanted to discover whether the gods' wisdom extended to recognizing human flesh when it was artfully disguised, whether their vaunted omniscience could penetrate clever deception. The experiment revealed both the limits of divine perception and the depths of Tantalus's moral corruption. Most of the gods immediately recognized what they were being offered and recoiled in horror. But Demeter, distracted by grief over her daughter's disappearance, accidentally consumed a portion of the child's shoulder. The fact that even one god could be fooled, even temporarily, seemed to justify Tantalus's suspicions about the fallibility of divine nature. The twist that sealed Tantalus's eternal punishment was not the obvious crime of cannibalism or the violation of hospitality laws, though both offenses were unforgivable. The real transgression lay in his motivation for the act. He had not killed his son in madness or rage, but in cold scientific curiosity, treating the child as experimental material in his investigation of divine psychology. The gods punished him not just for murder, but for the calculating mind that could reduce paternal love to data points in a philosophical inquiry. His torment in Tartarus became a perfect reflection of his crime. Tantalus stands forever in a pool of water that recedes when he tries to drink, beneath fruit trees that lift their branches when he reaches for food. He experiences eternal hunger and thirst, not as random cruelty, but as cosmic justice, forced to feel the same desperate need he had ignored in his son. The king who had sacrificed everything meaningful for the sake of knowledge spends eternity learning what it means to want something essential. and be denied it forever. While Tantalus had been punished for scientific curiosity turned monstrous, Sisyphus faced eternal torment for the very intelligence that had made him the most successful king of his generation. The ruler of Corinth possessed a mind that could find loopholes in any agreement, solutions to impossible problems, and escape routes from situations that would have destroyed lesser men. His cleverness had built a thriving city and secured his dynasty, but it had also taught him to believe that no authority was absolute enough to constrain his will. Sisyphus had cheated death itself on multiple occasions, using wit and negotiation to avoid the fate that claimed other mortals. When Thanatos came to collect his soul, the king convinced the god of death to demonstrate how the chains of mortality worked, then used the moment of explanation to bind death himself. With Thanatos imprisoned, no one in the world could die, creating chaos among both mortals and immortals that forced Zeus to intervene personally. The king's release of death was negotiated rather than imposed, another victory for intelligence over divine authority. He agreed to submit to mortality in exchange for certain guarantees about his treatment in the afterlife. Contracts so cleverly worded that they seemed to protect his interests while satisfying divine justice. Even in surrender, Sisyphus managed to turn defeat into a form of qualified success. His final trick was the most audacious of all. Before descending to Hades, Sisyphus instructed his wife to leave his body unburied and to perform none of the rituals that would ensure his peaceful rest among the dead. When he arrived in the underworld, he complained to Persephone about this neglect, arguing that he could not properly join the ranks of the deceased until his burial obligations had been fulfilled. The Queen of the Dead, moved by what seemed like reasonable concern for proper procedure, allowed Sisyphus to return to life temporarily so that he could arrange his own funeral. Once back in Corinth, he naturally ignored the purpose of his resurrection and continued ruling as if nothing had happened. He had successfully negotiated his way out of death itself, using divine compassion and bureaucratic regulations as tools for escaping the ultimate limitation. The twist that finally trapped Sisyphus was not external force, but the very success of his schemes. His cleverness had become so comprehensive that he could no longer conceive of problems without solutions, challenges without workarounds, or authorities without weaknesses to exploit. When Zeus finally dragged him back to the underworld for permanent punishment, Sisyphus was genuinely surprised that his appeals and arguments were simply ignored. The boulder he must push eternally up the mountain represents the weight of his own intelligence turned against him. Each time he nears the summit, the stone rolls back down, forcing him to begin again with the knowledge that success is impossible. The man who had spent his life finding ways around every obstacle was condemned to face one that could not be circumvented, outsmarted, or negotiated with. His punishment was not random cruelty, but perfect justice. Eternal confrontation with a problem that has no clever solution. While Sisyphus had been destroyed by the very completeness of his mortal cleverness, the twin sons of Leda faced a different kind of torment born from their mixed heritage. Castor and Pollux shared the same mother but different fathers. One born of a mortal king and the other sired by Zeus himself during his seduction of their mother in the form of a swan. This division of divine and human blood created a bond between them that was both unbreakable and fundamentally tragic. Pollux inherited his divine father's immortality and strength, while Castor possessed only the exceptional courage and skill that marked the greatest of mortal heroes. They grew up inseparable, training together and fighting as a single unit that no enemy could overcome. Their teamwork transcended ordinary military cooperation to become something almost mystical, each brother anticipating the other's movements with supernatural precision. The twins joined Jason's expedition to retrieve the Golden Fleece, where their complementary abilities made them invaluable members of the crew. Pollux' divine strength could overcome obstacles that would have stopped mortal men, while Castor's tactical brilliance found solutions to problems that even immortal power could not simply smash through. They saved the Argo from attacking harpies, defeated hostile kings, and helped navigate the ship through supernatural dangers that claimed other heroes. Their reputation as the perfect partnership spread throughout the Mediterranean, inspiring other brothers to attempt the same kind of seamless cooperation, but never achieving more than a pale imitation of what the twins accomplished naturally. Castor and Pollux seemed to prove that blood could indeed conquer all obstacles, that love between brothers could bridge even the gap between mortal and divine nature. The Caledonian boar hunt brought them face to face with heroes whose pride could not tolerate being overshadowed by anyone, regardless of their abilities. When the twins worked together to corner the massive beast, driving it toward Atalanta's waiting arrow, their success sparked resentment among men who preferred individual glory to collective achievement. The expedition that should have celebrated heroic cooperation instead became a breeding ground for the jealousy that would destroy them. The twist that doomed Castor and Pollux was not external opposition, but the mathematical inevitability of their relationship. Pollux would remain young and strong forever, while Castor aged toward death like any mortal man. The perfect partnership that defined their lives was slowly being eroded by time itself, as the immortal brother watched helplessly, while his beloved twin grew older and weaker with each passing year. Castor's death in battle against their cousins, Edus and Lynceus, should have ended their story in tragedy, but instead it revealed the true cruelty of their situation. Pollux's grief was so absolute that he begged Zeus to let him share his immortality with his dead brother, to somehow restore the balance that had made their lives meaningful. The god's answer was both generous and terrible. The twins could share immortality, but only by alternating between life and death, one always conscious while the other slept in darkness. The gathering of heroes that assembled to hunt the monstrous boar ravaging Caledon seemed like a celebration of everything noble about the age of heroes, but it actually marked the beginning of their systematic destruction through their own character flaws. King Omeneus had forgotten to honor Artemis in his harvest sacrifices, and the goddess had responded by sending a beast the size of a bull, with tusks that could tear through bronze shields, and a hide that turned aside most spears. The cream of Greek heroism answered the call. Theseus and Pirithous, Jason and the sons of the North Wind, Castor and Pollux with their perfect coordination, and Atalanta, whose speed and skill with the bow had made her legendary throughout the civilized world. Each hero brought weapons blessed by gods and reputations, earned through impossible victories, yet their very excellence contained the seeds of the disaster that followed. Meleager, Prince of Caledon and the hunt's nominal leader, fell in love with Atalanta. The moment he saw her string her silver bow, his infatuation was immediate and overwhelming, the kind of passion that poets celebrated, but wise men learned to fear. He found himself making decisions based not on tactical necessity, but on opportunities to impress the huntress, whose attention seemed focused entirely on the approaching danger. The boar itself was magnificent and terrible, a creature of divine wrath that moved through the forest like a living earthquake. Its tusks dripped with foam that burned whatever it touched, and its eyes held an intelligence that suggested it understood exactly what kind of havoc it was creating. When it charged the assembled heroes, several fled immediately, recognizing that this was no ordinary beast, but a manifestation of immortal anger. Atalanta drew first blood with an arrow that found the gap between the creature's shoulder plates, a shot that required perfect timing and courage, that impressed even heroes who had thought themselves beyond surprise. The wound was not fatal, but it marked the beginning of the end for the beast and established the huntress as the expedition's most skilled participant. Meleager watched her success with pride that was already transforming into something more dangerous. The twist that destroyed the hunt was not the boar's resistance or divine intervention, but the argument that erupted over the distribution of honor after the beast finally fell to Meleager's spear. The prince awarded the creature's hide to Atalanta, recognizing her crucial contribution and hoping to win her favor through public acknowledgement of her skill. His uncles, Plexippus and Toxeus, challenged this decision with the fury of men whose pride had been wounded beyond endurance. Their objection was not based on tactics or tradition, but on the simple inability to accept that a woman had outperformed them in combat. The same masculine pride that had driven them to answer the call for heroes now demanded that they reject any evidence of their own limitations. When Meleager killed his uncles in the fight that followed, he was defending not just Atalanta's honor, but the principle that merit should determine recognition regardless of gender. The victory over the Caledonian boar should have been remembered as a triumph of cooperation and skill, but instead it became the first domino in a chain of destruction that would claim most of the heroes present. They had proven that they could defeat any monster except the ones that lived within their own hearts. The death of his uncles should have ended Meleager's role in the tragedy that began with the boar hunt, but instead it marked the moment when his heroic nature was finally consumed by forces beyond his control. His mother Althea faced an impossible choice between grief for her dead brothers and love for her son, a decision that would have broken any ordinary woman, but became something far more terrible in the hands of someone who possessed the power to act on her conflicting emotions. When Meleager was born, the three fates had appeared to Althea with a prophecy and a symbol. They told her that her son would live only as long as a specific piece of wood remained unburned, then threw a branch into the fire before vanishing back into whatever realm controlled mortal destiny. Althea had snatched the burning wood from the flames and hidden it away, believing that she could protect her child from fate itself through careful preservation of this mystical anchor to his life. For years, the charred branch had remained hidden in a bronze chest, a secret that Althea shared with no one and tried not to think about even in her darkest moments. She had watched her son grow into a hero whose courage and strength seemed to make the fates' warning irrelevant, whose achievements suggested that exceptional mortals might indeed transcend the limitations that bound ordinary people. The news of her brother's death reached Althea while she was sacrificing to the gods in thanksgiving for Meleager's victory over the boar. The messenger's words struck her like physical blows, detailing how her son had killed Plexippus and Toxeus in defense of a foreign woman's honor. The grief that filled her was pure and primitive, uncompromised by rational consideration of circumstances or justice. Her walk to the bronze chest felt like a funeral procession, each step carrying her closer to a decision that would define the rest of her existence. She understood perfectly what retrieving the branch would mean, but understanding did nothing to diminish the compulsion that drove her forward. The wood felt warm in her hands, as if it had been waiting all these years for this moment of terrible purpose. The twist that made Meleager's death particularly cruel was not the matricidal nature of his execution, though that violation of natural law was horrifying enough. The real tragedy lay in the timing of Althea's decision. She threw the branch into the fire while consumed by fresh grief, acting on impulse rather than settled judgment, and realized the full magnitude of what she was doing only as the flames began to consume the wood. As the branch burned, Meleager felt fire spreading through his own body, a heat that originated in his chest and radiated outward until every nerve screamed with agony. He understood immediately what was happening and why. recognizing his mother's grief even as he burned with the consequences of his own choices. His last words were not curses against her betrayal, but expressions of love for the woman who had protected him for so many years before destroying him in a moment of overwhelming pain. Althea watched the branch burn completely to ash, then threw herself from the palace walls, rather than live with the knowledge of what her grief had accomplished. The hero whose life had been tied to a piece of wood died alone, and in agony, while the mother who had preserved him through careful love learned that some emotions are too powerful to be controlled by wisdom or affection. While Meleager had died from the passionate choices of those who loved him, Ganymede discovered that divine desire could be even more destructive than mortal grief. The young prince of Troy possessed beauty so perfect that it seemed to emanate light, drawing the attention of gods and mortals alike with an intensity that transformed admiration into obsession. His face held the kind of symmetry that artists spent lifetimes trying to capture, and his movements carried a grace that made ordinary human motion appear clumsy by comparison. Zeus first saw the boy, while the god was soaring above Mount Ida in the form of an eagle, surveying the mortal realm with the casual interest of one who owned everything he observed. Ganymede was tending his father's flocks in a meadow dotted with spring flowers, singing to himself while the sheep grazed peacefully around him. The sight stopped the king of the gods entirely, freezing him in mid-air as he struggled to comprehend how mortal flesh could achieve such aesthetic perfection. The abduction was swift and irrevocable. Zeus descended in his eagle form and grasped the boy in talons that were gentle enough to avoid injury, but strong enough to make resistance impossible. Ganymede found himself lifted from the earth he had never left, carried through clouds toward a destination he could not imagine. His cries for help faded into wind that carried no sound back to the meadow where his sheep stood bleating in confusion. Olympus received its newest resident with the mixture of celebration and unease that marked most of Zeus's decisions. The boy was installed as cupbearer to the gods, given the honor of serving ambrosia and nectar at divine feasts, while immortal beings discussed matters that no mortal was meant to understand. He was dressed in robes that cost more than kingdoms and given quarters more luxurious than any palace on earth. The gods treated Ganymede with a courtesy that bordered on reverence, recognizing that his presence reflected Zeus's personal desires and could not be questioned without challenging the supreme deity directly. He was praised for his beauty, complimented on his service, and included in conversations that revealed the hidden workings of the universe. Yet beneath their kindness lay the uncomfortable awareness that they were witnessing an ongoing crime that none of them had the power or courage to address. The twist that made Ganymede's situation particularly cruel was not his separation from mortal life, though that loss was devastating enough. The real torture lay in the gradual realization that his beauty was a prison more absolute than any chained Zeus might have used. Every god who looked at him saw only the physical perfection that had attracted divine attention, reducing his personality to a decorative afterthought that no one bothered to explore. He remained forever young and beautiful, granted immortality that preserved his appearance at the exact moment when Zeus had first desired him. But this gift was also a curse that made growth and change impossible. Ganymede was trapped not just on Olympus, but in a single moment of his own existence, forced to serve as cupbearer while watching eternity stretch ahead of him without possibility of evolution or escape. The boy who had been chosen for his beauty learned that being perfect meant never being allowed to become anything else. Where Ganymede had been imprisoned by his beauty, Hyacinth discovered that being loved by gods could be even more dangerous than being ignored by them. The Spartan prince possessed the kind of athletic grace that made every movement appear effortless, whether he was running across mountainous terrain or competing in the elaborate games that marked religious festivals. His laughter had the quality of music, and his friendship carried a warmth that made those around him feel more alive simply by proximity. Apollo's attraction to the young mortal began as aesthetic appreciation for physical perfection, but quickly deepened into something more complex and possessive. The god of music and poetry found himself inspired by Hyacinth's presence to create works of unprecedented beauty, songs that captured the essence of mortal joy and made even immortal audiences weep with recognition of what they had lost through their divine nature. Their friendship seemed to benefit both participants equally. Apollo shared knowledge that no mortal had ever possessed, teaching Hyacinth secrets of music and prophecy that transformed the prince from a merely gifted athlete into something approaching a divine herald. In return, Hyacinth offered the god something far more precious, the experience of genuine mortal emotion, uncompromised by the calculating detachment that marked most immortal relationships. They spent days together in activities that combined divine power with mortal enthusiasm. Apollo would guide the sun's chariot while Hyacinth rode beside him, seeing the earth spread out below like a living map. They hunted together in forests where no mortal had ever walked, pursuing creatures that existed only in the spaces between reality and myth. Their competitions in athletics and music pushed both participants to achievements that neither could have reached alone. Zephyrus, the west wind, watched their growing intimacy with jealousy that slowly transformed from disappointment into murderous rage. The god had courted Hyacinth himself, but had been rejected in favor of Apollo's more obvious charms, a humiliation that festered in his immortal consciousness like an infected wound. Every moment of happiness between the prince and the sun god intensified Zephyrus's sense of personal injury and cosmic injustice. The twist that destroyed Hyacinth was not divine jealousy, expressing itself through obvious violence, but the way love itself became the instrument of death. During one of their athletic competitions, Apollo threw a discus with just enough divine strength to make the cast impressive without risking injury to his mortal friend. Zephyrus waited until the bronze disc was at the peak of its arc, then used his power over air currents to redirect its flight. The discus struck Hyacinth in the head, with force that killed him instantly, but the cruel precision of the attack made it appear to be a tragic accident rather than deliberate murder. Apollo cradled his dying friend while Zephyrus watched from invisible heights, satisfied that his revenge had been achieved through methods that could not be traced back to him. The god of music found himself holding a beautiful corpse and facing the knowledge that his own divine nature had made this tragedy inevitable. From Hyacinth's spilled blood, Apollo caused the first hyacinth flowers to bloom, purple blossoms marked with letters that spelled out words of eternal grief. While Hyacinth had died from the jealousy of a rejected lover, Adonis faced destruction through the competing affections of two goddesses, whose rivalry made mortal life impossible to sustain. Born from the union of Myrrha and her own father after Aphrodite cursed the girl with unnatural desire, Adonis entered the world already marked by divine manipulation and familial tragedy. His beauty was so overwhelming that it seemed to distort reality around him, making flowers bloom more vibrantly and causing animals to lose their natural wariness. Aphrodite claimed the infant immediately after his birth, recognizing in his perfect features the ideal lover she had spent eternity seeking among gods and mortals. She raised him in secret gardens where time moved differently than in the mortal world, feeding him ambrosia and surrounding him with pleasures that would have driven ordinary humans to madness. The goddess of love became both mother and eventual lover to the boy, creating a relationship that violated every natural boundary. Persephone's first sight of Adonis occurred when Aphrodite foolishly brought him to the underworld for safekeeping, during one of her many conflicts with other Olympians. the Queen of the Dead found herself experiencing emotions she had thought impossible in her shadowy realm. Feelings that brought color and warmth to a world defined by endings and separation. She refused to return the youth when Aphrodite came to retrieve him, claiming that the underworld's need for beauty exceeded any surface world consideration. The dispute between the goddesses escalated beyond personal animosity to become a conflict that threatened the stability of both realms. Aphrodite's realm of love and desire could not function properly without its perfect embodiment, while Persephone's underworld had been transformed by Adonis's presence into something approaching paradise. Zeus found himself forced to mediate between two of his most powerful relatives, each of whom possessed compelling claims to the youth's company. The solution that Zeus imposed seemed fair on its surface, but was actually designed to torment all three participants equally. Adonis would spend 4 months of each year with Aphrodite, 4 months with Persephone, and 4 months alone, free to choose his own companions and activities. This division satisfied neither goddess, while ensuring that Adonis would never experience sustained happiness or genuine freedom. The twist that sealed Adonis's fate was not the obvious jealousy between his divine lovers, but the way their competing claims had made him incapable of forming authentic relationships with anyone. He had been passed between goddesses like a beautiful object, never allowed to develop his own desires or make meaningful choices about his existence. When he finally asserted independence by choosing to hunt the Caledonian boar during his free months, he was acting not from courage, but from a desperate need to prove that he could make decisions without divine permission. The boar that killed him was sent by Artemis, but not from anger at his hunting in her sacred groves. The goddess of the hunt recognized that Adonis had never learned to assess real danger because he had always been protected by divine power. His death was not murder, but the inevitable result of inexperience meeting genuine peril. The most beautiful man who ever lived died because he had never been allowed to live as anything except an object of desire, leaving him incapable of surviving in a world that contained actual consequences, while Adonis had been destroyed by divine protection that prevented him from learning to protect himself. Jason discovered that achieving impossible goals could be more devastating than failing them. The rightful king of Iolcus had grown up believing that reclaiming his stolen throne was simply a matter of proving his worth through heroic achievement. But his uncle Peleus understood that sending him after the Golden Fleece was really a sophisticated form of execution disguised as noble quest. The heroes who answered Jason's call to join the Argonauts were drawn not by loyalty to his cause, but by the opportunity to participate in something unprecedented. The ship Argo itself was a marvel of divine craftsmanship, built with timber from Dodona's sacred oak, and blessed by Athena with the power of speech and prophecy. No expedition had ever assembled such a concentration of legendary skill, and no goal had ever seemed both so important and so impossible to achieve. The journey to Colchis tested every member of the crew in ways that revealed both their strengths and their fatal limitations. They navigated between the clashing rocks that crushed ships in their supernatural embrace, survived encounters with sirens and harpies, and proved their worth in challenges that had destroyed every previous expedition. Jason's leadership during these trials seemed to justify the confidence his followers had placed in him. King Aeetes of Colchis agreed to surrender the Golden Fleece if Jason could complete 3 tasks that no mortal had ever survived: yoking fire-breathing bulls, ploughing a field with dragon's teeth, and defeating the warriors that sprang from the planted seeds. The challenges were designed to kill him in spectacular fashion, providing entertainment for the court while demonstrating the futility of Greek ambition to his barbarian subjects. Medea's intervention changed everything. The sorceress daughter of Aeetes fell in love with Jason at first sight and provided him with magic powerful enough to complete the impossible tasks. Her assistance made him invulnerable to the bull's fire, gave him strength to control the bronze beasts, and revealed the trick needed to turn the dragonborn warriors against each other instead of him. The twist that destroyed Jason was not his betrayal of Medea years later, though that choice would bring terrible consequences. The real catastrophe lay in his discovery that achieving the impossible had been meaningless. The golden fleece possessed no power beyond its symbolic value, and retrieving it did nothing to help him reclaim his kingdom or fulfill his destiny. His uncle Peleus simply refused to honor their agreement, forcing Jason to realize that his greatest triumph had been irrelevant to his actual problems. He had spent years assembling heroes and crossing impossible distances to retrieve a trophy that changed nothing about his fundamental situation. The fleece hung in his quarters like a beautiful reminder of wasted effort, proof that courage and determination meant nothing when opposed by entrenched political power. Jason learned too late that some quests are designed not to be completed, but to consume the lives of those naive enough to attempt them. The sorceress who had made Jason's victory possible found herself trapped in a foreign land by the very love that had motivated her betrayal of family and homeland. Medea had abandoned everything she knew to follow a man who promised her a life of honor and happiness in Greece. But she discovered that her barbarian origins made acceptance impossible, no matter how valuable her contributions to Jason's success had been. The Greek cities they visited treated her with a combination of fear and contempt that poisoned every interaction. Her knowledge of herbs and poisons, which had saved the Argonauts countless times during their journey, was seen as evidence of her inherently evil nature. The magic that had made the impossible quest achievable became proof that she could never be trusted as a proper Greek wife and mother. Jason's growing distance from her was not sudden betrayal, but gradual abandonment, a slow retreat from intimacy that became obvious only when he announced his intention to marry Glos, daughter of King Creon of Corinth. His explanation was political rather than romantic. He needed a Greek wife to secure his position, and their children required a mother whose bloodline would not mark them as foreign outcasts in their own homeland. The logic of his decision was flawless from a practical standpoint, but it revealed how thoroughly he had learned to see their relationship as a tool for advancing his ambitions, rather than a bond between equals. Medea recognized that she had been useful to him during the quest, but had become a liability now that he needed to establish himself as a respectable ruler. Her love had made his success possible, but that same success required him to discard her. Her revenge was not the passionate outburst of a woman scorned, but the calculated response of someone who had been systematically erased from the story of her own contributions. The poisoned robe she sent to Glos was designed to burn with flames that could not be extinguished, killing both the bride and her father when he tried to save her. The horror of their deaths served notice that Medea would not disappear quietly into exile. The twist that made Medea's revenge particularly devastating was not the murder of Jason's new wife, shocking as that crime was, but her decision to kill her own children by him. She understood that Jason's real vulnerability lay not in his political ambitions, but in his love for the sons who represented his future dynasty. By destroying them, she was not just punishing him for his betrayal, but ensuring that his bloodline would end with him. The children's deaths were not committed in rage, but in cold recognition that this was the only way to inflict permanent damage on a man who had learned to treat love as a renewable resource. Jason had shown her that people could be discarded when they became inconvenient, so she applied the same logic to remove what he valued most. Her escape to Athens in a chariot drawn by dragons was not triumph, but the flight of someone who had destroyed her own capacity for human connection in order to achieve perfect justice. The children who grew up hearing stories of Jason's quest and Medea's revenge inherited a world where heroism had been systematically revealed as either futile or corrupting. The sons and daughters of the great heroes understood that divine blood was more curse than blessing, that impossible achievements led to impossible expectations, and that the gods' attention was something to be avoided rather than courted. These younger heroes approached their inherited responsibilities with a wariness that would have seemed like cowardice to their parents' generation. They had watched Heracles destroy himself through strength, seen Perseus become enslaved to his own reputation, and witnessed the way Theseus's certainty had transformed him into the kind of tyrant he had once opposed. The lessons were clear to anyone wise enough to learn from others' mistakes. Yet the world still required heroes to face the monsters and dangers that threatened mortal civilization. The age of great quests might be ending, but dragons still needed slaying, and cities still required defending. The younger generation found themselves caught between the necessity of heroic action and the knowledge that such action inevitably corrupted or destroyed those who attempted it. Their solution was to embrace limitation rather than transcendence, to seek victory through collaboration rather than individual excellence, and to treat their achievements as temporary necessities rather than eternal glory. They formed alliances that distributed both risk and credit among multiple participants, ensuring that no single person would bear the full weight of divine attention or public expectation. The Epigoni, sons of the Seven against Thebes, finally succeeded in destroying the city that had defeated their fathers, but they did so with none of the grandeur that had marked earlier expeditions. Their victory was methodical rather than glorious, achieved through siegecraft and patience rather than heroic charges and divine intervention. They celebrated their success quietly and dispersed quickly, understanding that lingering too long in the spotlight of achievement invited the kind of attention that had destroyed their predecessors. The twist that defined this final generation was not their success or failure in combat, but their conscious decision to remain mortal in spirit even when offered opportunities for divine elevation. When gods appeared with gifts or challenges, they politely declined rather than accepting tests that had destroyed better men. They had learned that the age of heroes was ending not because the world no longer needed champions, but because being a champion had become incompatible with remaining human. Their greatest achievement was collective rather than individual. They managed to transition the world from an age where problems were solved by exceptional individuals toward one where solutions emerged from cooperation and shared responsibility. The last heroes saved civilization, not by transcending it, but by choosing to remain part of it, understanding that some prices were too high to pay even for the most glorious victories. When the gods stopped walking among mortals, the change was not sudden but gradual, like the slow retreat of morning mist from mountain valleys. The divine beings who had once appeared in person to challenge heroes or offer assistance began to communicate through dreams and omens, maintaining distance that protected both sides from the destructive intimacy that had characterized the age of heroes. Zeus looked down from Olympus at a world where his descendants no longer sought impossible achievements or challenged divine authority, and he found himself experiencing something approaching relief. The heroes had been magnificent, but their magnificence had required constant intervention to prevent them from destroying themselves and everyone around them. The new generation's modest ambitions created fewer problems for both mortal and immortal realms. The monsters that had provided challenges for heroes began to disappear as well, not through conquest, but through simple attrition, without divine anger to sustain them or heroic opposition to give their existence. Meaning creatures like the Sphinx and Chimera faded back into the mythical realms from which they had emerged. The world became safer, but also smaller, defined by human limitations rather than supernatural possibilities. The poets who sang of the vanished heroes faced the challenge of explaining to audiences who had never seen divine intervention why such stories mattered in a world governed by natural law. They transformed the tales from literal history into moral instruction, teaching lessons about the dangers of pride and the importance of accepting human limitations. The heroes became symbols rather than models, warnings rather than inspiration. Those few mortals who still possessed traces of divine blood learned to hide their abilities rather than celebrating them. They understood that the age when such gifts brought honor and recognition had passed, replaced by one where difference of any kind invited suspicion and persecution. The bloodline of heroes continued, but in secret, their descendants living as ordinary people who occasionally performed extraordinary acts without seeking credit or reward. The twist that marked the end of the heroic age was not that it concluded in tragedy, but that it succeeded in its ultimate purpose. The heroes had served as bridges between divine and mortal realms, absorbing the worst effects of godly interference in human affairs and gradually teaching both sides the necessity of separation. Their sacrifices had purchased a world where ordinary people could live ordinary lives, without being conscripted into cosmic dramas they did not understand. The silence that followed their passing was not emptiness, but peace. The quiet of a world that had learned to solve its problems through human wisdom rather than supernatural intervention. The gods withdrew to Olympus to contemplate their own natures, while mortals built civilizations based on cooperation and shared knowledge rather than individual excellence. The Age of Heroes had ended not in failure, but in the fulfillment of its deepest purpose, teaching the world that some boundaries were meant to be respected and that the greatest victory was learning when not to fight. As we reach the end of these ancient tales, a pattern emerges from the darkness that claimed every hero whose story we have followed tonight. Each began with gifts that should have been blessings, strength that could move mountains, beauty that stopped time, cleverness that could outwit death itself, or speed that outran the wind. Yet every single advantage became the instrument of its possessor's destruction, not through external enemies, but through the fundamental incompatibility between divine power and mortal hearts. The heroes we have met were not destroyed by their flaws, but by their virtues taken to impossible extremes. Heracles fell, not because he was weak, but because his strength isolated him from human connection. Perseus was damned not by cowardice, but by a sense of justice that transformed him into the very thing he fought against. Achilles burned not from fear, but from rage. So pure it consumed everything he touched. Their greatness was real, but greatness extracted a price that no mortal soul was designed to pay. The gods who created these tragic figures were not evil, merely careless with the mathematics of divine inheritance. They gave their mortal children power without wisdom, abilities without the restraint needed to use them wisely, and immortal appetites trapped within mortal time frames. The heroes became living experiments in what happened when finite beings were granted infinite capabilities, and the results were as predictable as they were devastating. Yet their stories serve a purpose that transcends entertainment or moral instruction. These tales whisper to us across millennia about the dangers that still lurk within human ambition and the price of forgetting our essential limitations. In an age when we possess technologies that approach divine power, when we can reshape nature and extend life and communicate across impossible distances, the warnings embedded in these ancient tragedies feel more relevant than ever. The peace that followed the Age of Heroes was not purchased through their victories, but through their sacrifices, teaching both gods and mortals that some boundaries exist for good reason. They showed us that being human means accepting limitation, that true strength lies in knowing when not to use power, and that the greatest heroes are often those wise enough never to become heroes at all. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, remember that the monsters these heroes faced were not the creatures they fought, but the possibilities they became, in choosing to remain human despite our growing capabilities. We honor their memory and avoid repeating their magnificent, terrible mistakes. Sometimes the greatest victory is the battle we choose not to fight, the power we decide not to claim, the heights we resist the urge to climb. The age of heroes is over, and in that ending lies our salvation.